Welcome back to 1122, second half of Western Civ. We're going to talk today about one of the consequences of the Columbian Exchange. In our last lecture, we talked a little bit about the impact of Christianity as one of those factors that gave the Europeans a psychological advantage, if nothing else. Here, I want to talk about one of the direct consequences of the Columbian Exchange, and that is the emergence of Atlantic slavery in the 15th and 16th centuries. We're going to speak generally here. I guess the bigger context for Atlantic slavery is triangular trade. We talked about this earlier when we talked about the Columbian Exchange. Triangle, African slaves, New World commodities, sugar, cotton, tobacco, European manufactured goods, creating a vast circuit of trade in the Atlantic basin, tying Europe, Africa, North and South America together. Significances. Well, it gives Europeans and students a chance to look at the historical other when we talk about Atlantic slavery, as these Africans are outside of European history, outside of Christian cosmology. They are the other. They can be treated with disdain, with contempt. You can do anything you want with the other. Once you designate a group of people as the other, you can legislate against them. You can take their land. You can take their professions. You can take their children. You can take their lives if you want. So this gives us an insight into how the other as a historical concept can work. Other significances: Africans are going to form the essential labor for the production of commodity crops in the New World. This is the creation of the wealth of the Western world. This wealth is built on the back of African, and then of course later African American slaves. This creates this Atlantic world commerce and trade. Another significance, I suppose, would be the diaspora of West Africans. Diaspora, fancy word meaning to scatter. What's the number I've always heard? 11.5 million, something like that, of Africans taken forcibly from their homes and shipped across the Atlantic to the New World. Key concepts, we mentioned the other just now. Another concept worth keeping in mind is that of agency. Agency is the will and the capacity to act. We use it here in this story of Atlantic slavery because we've generally told this story from the point of view of the white slave owner. After all, he's the one that left diaries and letters and journals and the material that the primary sources that historians use in their research. Over the past few generations, however, rising historians have discovered that even though Africans were oppressed in slavery, that they still had agency. They could still act. They still had the will and the capacity to act. They could fake an illness. They could run away. They could learn to read, become literate, become more like the white person. They could become Christian, also making them more like their white owners. They could kill their master. This happens rarely, but it does happen. And of course, agency is also important here in the sense that the African slave trade is controlled by African chieftains. We have records of European captains waiting aboard ship for months, waiting and waiting until the African chieftain decides that it's time to make the trade. So the slave trade itself is controlled by Africans. In other words, the Africans have agency. This makes our story more complex, doesn't it? It is not simply a story of Europeans imposing their will on Africans. Africans are very much a part of this story. Key concept here: slave societies are societies with slaves. A slave society is one in which slavery is fundamental, essential to the working of that society. A slave society, well, let's just look at the phrase. The word slave is used as an adjective to describe the society. If you remove slaves from a slave society, that society's economy would collapse. A good example of a slave society, well, right here in the American Southeast. The old South, the antebellum South before the war, was a slave society. If you miraculously took the slaves away in 1834, the Southern economy would have collapsed in large part. Now, societies with slaves are different. Here, a slave could rise up out of that degraded position and become something else. In a slave society, a slave is a slave for life, and his children and his children's children. Slavery exists in perpetuity, forever. In societies with slaves, it's more mobile. A man or a woman could rise up out of that slave position. You see examples of this in those West African societies, where a man might become a slave as a POW, or as someone who owes a debt, but they could rise up out of that. So it's much more flexible. And in societies with slaves, let's face it, you could extract the slaves and the society would continue, probably without missing a beat, which is quite different from a slave society, where without slaves, the economy would collapse. I want to ask a basic question: why Africans? Why not use the Irish? Why not use some other people who are looked down upon? There are a number of reasons. Let's go through them. One, there appear to be an unlimited number of Africans. Two, the African slave trade already exists. All the Europeans have to do essentially is go shopping and make deals with the African chieftains for slaves in exchange for firearms or other European manufactured goods. Three, the sickle cell, this genetic mutation in Northwest Africa, gives the advantage to both, I guess, the slave and especially the slave owner, and that the sickle cell fights off malaria, which allows the slave owner's investment to live longer, makes his investment much safer. Four, Africans have the necessary skills that we need in the New World to produce the commodity crops: cotton, tobacco, indigo, rice, sugar. Sugar, of course, is the first of the great commodity crops. Five, why Africans? Similar climate. There's an assumption here that because these West Africans live in a subtropical or tropical zone, as we move directly westward across the Atlantic, they will be living again in a tropical or subtropical zone, similar climate, similar heat. So it's assumed that because they thrive here, they will thrive there as well. I think there's an accompanying assumption that if you took pasty, freckled Irishmen to Brazil, that they would wilt and die. They could not stand the dramatic change in climate. And then six, probably the most basic reason for Africans is they're black, they're color-coded. White equals free, black equals slave. Let's face it, an Irishman, an Irish slave, in theory, could dress up and look like a white person and escape his bondage. An African cannot do that. If you're in Barbados in the 17th century and you encounter an African, you know by definition that he's a slave, he's color-coded. I want to make a few remarks here about the Middle Passage. If you want to see the Middle Passage depicted in film, Steven Spielberg's movie Amistad does a nice job of this. This is a good depiction of what we think of again as the other, the historical other. Africans are stacked below decks of these ships. There's multiple decks quite often, hundreds of African slaves recently captured and traded. Now they're being taken across the Atlantic back to the New World to be sold and put to work. This is called the Middle Passage. These Africans are stripped. They're chained head to toe in the bowels of these ships, living in squalor, living in filth. It's difficult to imagine. These Africans had never been at sea. And for those of you who have been seasick, you can imagine the projectile vomiting that's going on here. A woman may have a baby, people might die. This is a truly horrendous situation. And when you think about the other, you can think about these Africans, and then imagine Europeans doing this to white Christians. It'd be much more difficult. Much more difficult to brutalize people who speak your language, worship the same God that you do, and share your skin color. Of course, when they reach the New World, these Africans are then auctioned off to the highest bidder quite often, and then dispersed throughout the Caribbean, South America, a fewer number into North America. If you look at our map here, you can see the percentages are much higher for South America and the Caribbean, the Lesser Antilles, than it would be to say Charleston or Savannah or Norfolk. Again, there's a reason for this: the climate and the nature of the work, the sugarcane production. This is brutal work in a terribly hot and humid climate, and this takes a toll on the slaves. So we have to constantly replenish our supply in these more southern latitudes. I can recommend another film, a recent film that got some notoriety. It's called 12 Years a Slave, which will give you some insights into this process of creating the African other, and then what they experience here in the New World as slaves. So I'm going to stop there with Atlantic slavery. And you can remember the key significances here. This is part of triangular trade. This is a major factor in creating that circuit of commerce in the Atlantic world. And this gives us a good insight into how the historical other can be created, and then what we can do with the other once we designate a group of people as different from us. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you.